once again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I'm looking forward to asking you some questions, things I've been thinking about, and many people have been thinking about. So I just thought to put it into context because you have access to a lot of the latest research and whatnot. And of course, no doubt you're going to incorporate some of that into what you do in your personal program. So I guess currently, what does your current workout look like in terms of frequency, volume, intensity, and whatnot?
Sure, yeah. I'm gonna hazard a guess that any listeners who are familiar with myself are aware that the majority of my training has and for a long time has been body weight based. So probably about 10 years ago, I for various kind of practical reasons I shifted to a more sort of body weight based program, and it was just through lack of access to facilities that I would have preferred to have trained in, and just getting fed up with training in the usual kind of like public gyms. And then over time, I've just grown to love it. I couldn't imagine myself going back to training regularly in any kind of facility really. And I treat kind of like, if I get to go, like if I came visited you, Richard, for example, that would be like a treat workout. Like I get to play with some cool equipment, but then I'm always happy to go back to my very, very simple, very Spartan kind of workout. So I typically I'll typically train anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week. And I'll do usually do full body routines. My main kind of routines are a kind of A-B routine, I call it, with which are both full body weight workouts, and they'll both include like kind of a horizontal and a vertical push and pull movement, some kind of lower body compound movement, and then maybe some sort of quote unquote core or trunk kind of focus movement. Um, and then my third workout is like a kind of I'll do it if I have time to do it, and it's more a case of I've accumulated some bits of equipment and some bands and some pulleys and some free weights and bits and bobs at home that I'll then play around with, and it will just be a little bit more of a variety workout for the sake of playing around with some things. But yeah, my not like so for example, I trained Monday. I did a like a neutral parallel grip kind of push up with some handles. I did a supinated grip. Sorry, I use a set of kind of adjustable handles. Did pull ups. Did a wall sit into super slow body weight squats. I did a dip. I did a body weight row, and that was it. Nice and easy. And then I trained yesterday, and I did a wide grip push up, and then a wide grip kind of pronated pull up, and then did kind of like a narrow push up, and then more of a narrow grip supinated pull up, and also did some single leg squats and kind of hip extensions as my lower body movement. And then Saturday I might do a sometimes I'll throw in on Saturday, like normally I'll train like literally just straight to like simple concentric failure, and that will be that. Single set per exercise. Won't really do any kind of advanced techniques in my normal kind of core workouts. But then on that Saturday one where I'll play around and I'll just kind of do whatever exercises kind of take my fancy. It will still be a body routine, will still involve kind of like some sort of upper body compound push, pull, lower body compound movement, and then maybe some more kind of like single joint movements peppered in there. And then I'll sometimes, I might, for example, decide I'm going to do a pull up, but I'll do a weighted pull up, like drop set or something like that. So I'll use a chain, I'll use a dumbbell, or I'll use some plates, and I'll maybe do 1 or 2 drops or something like that. So I'll pepper in those kind of advanced techniques, not through any kind of belief or evidence that they're any better to do in terms of adaptation or outcome, but more just because they're fun to do occasionally.
Right, right.
So yeah, I'm pretty laissez-faire with my training now as well. Like I definitely don't stress out if if for whatever reason, one of the reasons I like to kind of set myself like maybe 2 or 3 times training a week is because sometimes life gets in the way and I might only be able to train once that week. But at least I know I've trained. Like,
Right. Yeah, if you decide to train once a week and you miss one, you might not train for 2 weeks. If you decide to train 3 times, then if you miss one or two, you still got at least one workout. So,
exactly.
so I'm hearing about, if I listen correctly, maybe between 6 and 9 sets in a given session, somewhere in there.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and so I think it's you, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, that you've seen some studies that seem to indicate that some HIIT practitioners would improve from greater frequency. So, is that sort of referring to people who might only train once a week or every 10 days, that they might be better off? Or is it let's say, to use a simple example, let's say that I'm doing one workout a week, just to give an example, and I'm doing 8 sets. If I was to do the same number of sets, but have them doing in 4 workouts, so 2 set workouts, with the greater frequency, and some people I know have suggested that you're stimulating protein synthesis more often, even though it's a smaller amount. Is this a splitting hair thing, or is this something you think that can make some sort of significant difference?
So this is actually something that was proposed maybe 5, 6 years ago now. A nice paper from Jeremy Lenecke's lab out of University of Mississippi. I was actually one of the reviewers for it, and I spoke about this, I think, on Lawrence's podcast a number of years ago now. That, I mean, it has a lot of plausibility to it, because particularly in trained persons, there is an attenuated protein synthetic response to both protein and resistance training as a stimulus. And so the idea was that you could, by potentially stimulating it more, like the example you gave, instead of putting all of that volume into one workout where you're only ever going to peak your protein synthesis so high, anything extra you do over what you need to do is wasted, so to speak, under this kind of this model and this hypothesis. And so spreading it out might result in greater adaptation over the long run, greater accrual of proteins and hypertrophy. And it sounds perfectly plausible. It was an interesting hypothesis. Subsequent to that, though, actually, at the time I was quite intrigued by it. I played around with, instead of doing my kind of like 6 to 9 workout exercise workouts, I shifted to, for a little while, doing basically like daily workouts of like a push pull and like basically I did push up, pull up, and wall sit and squats like every day for like a period of like 4 weeks. And I was, I mean, I was destroyed by the end of it. Like I was so tired every day.
Right.
But subsequent to that, there has been more studies looking at frequency. There has been an accumulation of data to the point where we can actually have good quality meta-analyses looking at this question. And the reality is that for both strength and for hypertrophy in both untrained and trained individuals, there's not really any evidence that greater frequencies are any better than lower frequencies, at least when things are volume matched. So the idea of taking the volume that you would put into a given workout and spreading it over the week versus just doing it all in that one workout, the differences are trivial at best. And so, yeah, really, it kind of comes down to I quite like this because it sort of means that if, for example, I know ahead of time that I'm not going to be able to train like 2 or 3 times this week or whatever, and I'm not even necessarily convinced I need to train 2 or 3 times this week. I'm not convinced it's any better than training once a week, but I do enjoy training, so that's one
Yeah.
benefit of training slightly more
Yeah.
frequently. And it's enough that I feel like I can recover between workouts, and I'm not, constantly like just running on gas. But it's nice to have the flexibility of knowing that, like, okay, that one workout's going to be fine, and I don't know, maybe I'll like do like 1 or 2 more exercises than I might normally do and squeeze it into that one. The flexibility of knowing that, by and large, a lot of these variables that we toy around with are having at best trivial effects on any kind of outcomes of the outcomes which people care about: strength, hypertrophy, etc. So yeah, so it was a nice idea, but didn't pan out.
Okay, good. So, it's interesting too, when people are talking about frequency, volume, intensity, often it's how much can I create stimulus, but still manage my recovery resources so that I can recover from it. And people really try to fine tune that to, do just enough, not too much. Where I've sort of landed, I'd be interested in getting your feedback on it, is to kind of go in 6 week, give or take, could be 4 weeks, could be longer cycles, where I may purposely over time increase the frequency and volume until I feel myself, all the telltale signs of overtraining, and then just take anywhere from a week to 10 or even 12 days off completely. So rather than really try to fine tune everything on an ongoing basis and try to get it just right, I don't worry about it. I just do what I do. And then once I start to feel like, okay, I'm overdoing it, I take a week off or 10 days and let the body recover and then start it over. It just seems like an easier way to me of managing the whole thing rather than, is it an extra set, an extra whatever? You know what I mean? That type of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, if you look into the periodization literature, they do have a name for this. They call it functional overreaching. This idea that, I mean, they do it deliberately. They will plan in, they'll try to plan in training programs deliberate kind of like increases in volume, increases in intensity of effort, increases in load, etc. To the point where you're kind of they'll push you towards overtraining and then take that recovery time off. Now, again, like I'm not convinced that we have evidence that that's any better than just kind of like riding the average throughout. I'm fairly convinced that I could probably it would probably make imperceptible difference to my physique, my fitness, my performance, anything like that if I just completely went down to just doing like one full body workout a week, single sets to failure, blah blah blah, and did that for the rest of my life. I'm not convinced that there would be any meaningful differences to it. Any differences would be aesthetically probably imperceptible and not impacted by the training, probably more impacted by the amount of pizza I eat. But the actually, ice cream's my weakness, so we'll go with ice cream. But yeah, Lo, I think one of the benefits of doing that as well is it's nice. You can, particularly for people who like to train, like I've done that as well in the past as well, where I've kind of gone, do you know what? Like I'm in a phase where I do a lot of other activities outside as well, and I play golf. I occasionally will run. I used to run track. I play basketball. I like to walk a lot. So I'm a very, very active person anyway. But sometimes there'll be periods where, for whatever reason, I'm not doing all those other activities, and I feel the need to sort of like inject some more kind of stuff into. I feel like I want to use my body for things, and so I'll sometimes deliberately go, okay, well, like for the next like 2-3 weeks, like I know I'm not gonna, the weather's crap, so I ain't playing golf, or basketball's been cancelled for whatever reason for the next few weeks, or I'm not going to get the chance to get out and go for a hike at the weekends or whatever, so I'm going to maybe train a bit more, and then once I get back into that, I'm just going to take a week or two off and just let it sort of like recover itself out and then get back into the kind of usual routine. And again, that flexibility and being able to kind of find what fits your lifestyle and not sort of like stressing out and worrying that it's gonna completely tank your gains or or whatever is I find that to be very refreshing. And I think probably for the vast majority of people it's quite nice to know that you've got that flexibility.
Well, one of the things I found that it normally, when I train clients, layoffs happen spontaneously, i.e., they take a holiday, they get invited to a wedding out of town, a funeral, hopefully not too many funerals, and or they get a cold and whatnot. With the COVID thing in the last 2 years, I've had a number of clients who have been training without any breaks for quite a while because they haven't been taking holidays. They're certainly not getting invited to weddings and things like that. And I've had situations where somebody came and they said, I just feel like my energy level is not as great as it was, things like that. And I've simply told them, you know what, why don't you just stay home next week? And just take it and see what happens. And almost invariably, and normally I wouldn't need to do that because, as I said, it would happen spontaneously because life, as you put it, happens and interferes with their training, whereas COVID has sort of everybody's sitting at home, right? Not doing a whole lot. And I guess the other thing about some of the hair splitting, to bring it up too, is, if something is better or worse, ultimately, does it mean, assuming that we're going to reach our genetic potential, whatever that is, does it actually mean is that we're going to reach it in 3 years instead of 3.5 years, or whatever the number is? But once you've reached your genetic potential or come very close to it, your gains, no matter what program you're on, are going to become very small. And so a lot of the hair splitting, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anything you do is going to get you beyond your genetic potential, right? Other than the use of drugs or something of that.
Time machine, change your parents.
Exactly, a time machine, change of parents. And where I'm going with this is, the thing I hope to dive in with you is, the fitness industry, magazines and things like that, and even Hollywood movies and whatnot, give people the impression that you can look like the guy on the magazine cover. Whereas one of the things I point out to clients is, I say, how often do you see somebody who's 6'5"? If you see someone who's 6'5" or taller, usually they turn heads, they get noticed in a crowd, right? And so if you notice, that's pretty rare. How often do you see somebody in public whose musculature is so impressive that you kind of go, oh, look at that guy, right? He's right. And so if it were possible, because many men, obviously not a lot of women, but many men would love to look like that. If it were easy to do, and of course, what we're told is, well, yeah, but these guys live in the gym and they do it all day. And if I did that, maybe I could look that way too. Do you have any idea? I know that Mike Menzer used to say that was probably, and I'm assuming he was pulling these numbers just, sort of out of that, less than 1 in 100,000 men would have the genetics to have those kind of large muscles. Do you have any idea, just a normal person, because the expectations, I think, are often really unrealistic for people. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought this for a long time. One of the issues with resistance training studies or exercise studies in general is that demonstrating a difference between two protocols for an outcome over 6, 8, 10, 12, even 20 weeks, all it really tells you is that over that period of time, one produced adaptations at a greater rate. Not necessarily that, like you say, no, it may well be that, yes, training this way might get you to your potential faster. And I'm very, very, I'm fairly convinced that, for the vast majority of outcomes, adaptation is follows a like linear log growth curve over time. And we've done some interesting work with 20, who were kind enough to share data from just shy of 15,000 participants in their franchises, and we've modeled their strength adaptations over time, and it shows us quite robust kind of, most of the gains that people are getting, and again, appreciably, this is on average, but in general, the vast majority of people are getting the majority of adaptation in the first year of training. And this is for strength, of course. It may differ for something like hypertrophy or cardiorespiratory fitness or something like that. But I would probably put money on that the shape of the adaptation looks similar. But once it starts to reach that kind of like peak, it starts to plateau out, and over time, then adaptations become either too small to really measure to any meaningful degree, or are too small to be actually meaningful for anyone to really care about. And I think this is quite a robust phenomenon, because we've not only have we seen that in the Fit20 data, but alongside that, I mean, one of the criticisms we anticipated of us looking at that data is individuals in Fit20 studios all train following the same protocol. So from one perspective, it was very appealing to look at their data set, because we know this is what strength adaptation looks like to this specific protocol over time. And that is, they do a 6 exercise workout. It's all generally super slow, kind of single set to failure. They train once a week, and that's that. And so we anticipated we would get comments back, people saying, well, maybe they wouldn't have plateaued if they had increased their volume or increased their frequency or done this or done that, or varied it, periodized it, and stuff like that. So out of curiosity, we thought, well, one population that we know employs all of those techniques are powerlifters. They, like, the surveys that we have of powerlifters training practices in the scientific literature show that 99.9% of these individuals are doing all sorts of fancy stuff. They're varying this, they're doing that, they're periodizing, they have a mesocycle of this, a microcycle of that, and all of these kinds of things. Unfortunately, powerlifting is a nice sport to look at because the performance is essentially a strength test. So if you model performance over time, you are explicitly modeling strength over time. And we actually have an open data set of powerlifters from the Open Powerlifting. There's a website run by volunteers who collate all of this data. So we were able to take that data set, take a random sample of 10,000 lifters. So we kind of avoided any bias. We explicitly sort of randomly sampled them, and then modeled to see, well, what happens in powerlifters over time? Does their performance keep going up because they're constantly varying things, or they just keep improving? And they pretty much showed a small, I mean, one thing to appreciate is most people get into powerlifting after already having been engaged in resistance training for some time. So these are also more than likely trained individuals who they get into specifically powerlifting. And what you see is there is a small increase, kind of percentage-wise, in terms of strength performance over the first year or so of training, and then it starts to plateau out again. And so it's almost like, well, shifting to specifically training for powerlifting performance. So, barbell squat, bench, deadlift, there's a little bit of an increase, which you could potentially attribute to developing maybe a little bit of extra strength, but primarily the skill involved in doing those lifts. And then even that plateaus out. And on the whole, the vast majority of lifters are over time not really improving much. Most of their improvements are coming in the first year. And people will say, the smallest gains are meaningful in competition. And that's true in the context of a given competition in terms of where you place. But if we're talking generally about how does strength adapt, there are evidently ceilings. Last thing as well is we have another data set, which is just shy of 1.5 million individuals that have engaged in a variety of different training protocols. Like this is not data from people training HIIT. There's people training using power programs, multi-set this, and all sorts of varying different protocols. And even when we model that data over time, we're still working on it because it's quite a complex data set, but applying the same kinds of models, statistical models over time, it shows the same thing. Like, you see most of the gains in the first year, and then it starts to plateau out. And so it almost seems as though it really doesn't matter what you do, as long as you're training consistently and probably to a reasonable degree of effort, that you're probably going to get where you're going to get to. I've said on Lawrence's podcast a number of times, it's like all roads lead to Rome eventually. Consistency is probably the key.
Do you know Bryce Lee? Have you ever seen any of the podcasts? So Bryce made a point, which I really appreciated at one point. He said, when talking to clients, he said, I don't claim that our way is the best way. I claim it's the safest and most efficient. And I think that's fair. I think personally, I think it may very well be the best because of those things. Right? I mean, if you can get the same results in less time and not hurting yourself, to me, by definition, that means it's better. But of course, I would admit to my bias in doing these. But whatever else you might gain, most of us, if you've gotten used to, like right now, I've been training, and I think I'm met that overtraining thing. I'm feeling a little sluggish and whatnot, and I did like 3 sets, like some sort of lower body movement, some push and pull, more or less. I'm oversimplifying, every other day for about 4 or 5 weeks now, and I'm realizing, yeah, I think I need to take a layoff, or that was too frequent, right? But even that, when I call overtraining, only comes to, so let's say in a given week I do 4 of those. It's still only 12 sets
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
whole week, right? So what would I gain if I did lower intensity and brought it up to more sets? Well, don't doubt I would get more wear and tear in my body. And any possible, which I don't think would be the case, extra benefit would be very minimal in relation to the extra time and effort put in.
yeah, yeah. And
And
I think this is where like people need to ask themselves, think carefully about what is the reason, what is the motivation behind them, engaging in these kinds of activities. Some people, I think the hit crowd have a kind of like a reputation for, and it stems from things that like I think Ken Hutchins and the definition of exercise and all of this kind of stuff, which is like the reason you're doing this should be because you want the health, performance, etc. benefits out of it, and if that's what you want, this is what you should do. Um, I personally, I just don't think it's as simple as that, because I think by and large, like any claims of superiority between protocols, if we simplify, claims of superiority as being they produce greater improvements in this outcome compared to this protocol's effect on this outcome, ignore efficiency and things like that. By and large, I just don't think we have any evidence that any one protocol is more superior than the other, unless we're making like toy examples of like, I'm going to go do 1 rep with 50% of my 1 rep max versus a set, 2 sets to failure or something. It's like no one cares like about that comparison, because we already know which is going to beat it out. But 1 hard set to failure versus 3 sets to just shy of failure, it's by and large, when we actually really get down to the nitty gritty of comparing the outcomes between them, there's next to no difference. So then it really does come down to questions of like, well, if those outcomes are the same, and yes, most people doing this want that. Most people aren't just training because they enjoy training. Most people are training because they do want those outcomes.
right.
But then it comes back to, well, if you're going to get mostly the same benefits from a variety of different things, then what are the other reasons why you want to do it? Is it, if you only want them, then pick the most efficient one. If you want something that if you like training on machines in, certain environments, then go train there. If you're like me and you like going and training in the rain in your garden on your pull-up bar, then do that. If you like training, in groups, and do that. I think, yeah, it really comes down to, like you say, like what is best is what meets what you're after. Like what are your goals from training, and those goals don't have to be outcomes produced in terms of adaptation from the training stimulus, but can be other pros and cons of the training that you use to weigh up and see, does it meet my list of things I want from this experience?
Well, and what reminds me, I had a 24-year-old young man who was just about 2 weeks out from a bodybuilding contest. And he's single. He's basically at this point working in his parents' restaurant. He doesn't have a lot of other commitments, so he spends a lot of time in the gym. That's where he hangs out. He likes it. His friends are there. So when I sort of suggested to him that he could get similar results in a fraction of the time, it's not that he was quite open-minded and intelligent young man. It's not that he doubted it. Or actually found the workout quite demanding. But for him, that wasn't actually an advantage. It's like, why would I want to go to the gym less? I like going to the gym. This is what I like doing. I hang out with my buddies and I do this thing, and I do that. So that, to your point about that. And one of the things too is, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, I managed salespeople for a long time. And one of the things we used to say is people buy emotionally And then after the sale is made, they rationalize with reason and whatnot. And I think with fitness, many people, if they're honest with themselves, vanity is a very strong motivator, probably even more than health. And it doesn't make sense because looking good shouldn't be nearly as important as, managing your health and possibly improving your longevity. But let's face it, I sometimes say I'll defend vanity because, hey, if it gets you to the gym, right? And let's face it, most of us would probably spend a little more time looking in the mirror than we'd like to admit to see how we're doing, right? But where I'm going with this, as you said earlier, my weakness is ice cream. And because genetically, most of us, compared to any kind of standard from a magazine cover, have pretty limited ability to build excessively large muscles. But whatever muscles we can build will show up if you can get lean enough to have people see it. And if you're lean, because I've seen, for example, YouTube videos of yourself, which are shirt off and doing some exercises. And I've seen videos of you in a suit and tie doing presentations. And, with the latter one, probably nobody would accuse you or me of being a bodybuilder, right? But on this other
people
one,
would say, bro, do you even lift?
Yeah, that sort of thing, right? Or a pencil neck or whatever they say, right? But then when you're working out, if you stay lean, and I do find sometimes in the HIIT community, and even with clients, and I've heard people say, I can't control what people do after they leave. So I just focus on getting them stronger and not really go with the diet. And of course, the stats on losing fat and maintaining it long-term are really, really dismal, right? But if you can dial in that part of the equation, it makes a big difference. Like I remember if you see pictures of shirtless American football players, who are particularly the linesmen and whatnot, these are great, big, powerful men. And some of them don't really look it, right?
Yeah.
Because and then of course, if you see some other guy, I remember the first time I went to a bodybuilding contest, not a professional one, but an amateur one, which I suspect, people weren't using the kind of drugs they are in some of the other ones. When I stood right up next to the guy, I was surprised to say, he's not that big. He looks enormous on stage, right? With the proper posing, lights, and he's very lean, but he's not that big. But what he does have, he's showing to the best possible effect. And I think that sort of also contributes to the unrealistic expectations, because people think these bodybuilders are bigger than they actually are, not counting the mass freaks that you see today, which are chemical experiments, right? But dieting is probably much harder than working out.
And it's one thing I always find surprising is actually a lot of people don't realize, like, this is going to sound like an old comment, but how small a lot of bodybuilders really are when you put them next to very large, like really large individuals. Like there's some great pictures of like I can't remember who, but there's pictures of like bodybuilders stood next to like the mountain, and they look tiny. They look so like insignificant compared to like genuinely enormous humans. One of my PhD students, he is actually a bodybuilder, but he's tall. He's I think he's 6'5" or 6'6", and he's a big guy. And there's individuals who I know who you see pictures of them on their own with, like, say, ideal lighting and things like that, enormous on these pictures. But then when you see a picture of them stood next to my PhD student, like, he dwarfs them. He makes them look suddenly like tiny. And I think, people can be very misled by like, lighting can be deceiving, and making sure that there's no one else in the shot for perspective.
Well, I don't know if you're aware, but in 2008, and 2009, or 2007, 2008, I competed in amateur bodybuilding contests. And I learned how much illusion there is, right? And I have, see here in my facility, I have a picture of myself at that time. And people go, whoa, you look pretty good. And I say, keep it in perspective. I'm 6 feet tall. In that picture, I weighed 162.7 pounds, right? That's small.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, and I placed third in what they call a novice. Novice means you've never competed before. Lightweight means you're one of the little guys. But I placed third out of 8 guys. Nice. Which, and I was 50 years old at the time. So, I sort of felt pretty good about that. But then I realized between the dieting, the incredible 3 or 4 layers of tanning, the bright lights, and I also even hired a posing coach. And a posing coach teaches you to hide your weak parts. And, things like you put your arm next to your body and squish it up against your body, right? Yeah. In order to make your bicep look significantly bigger than it is. And it's all over the place. So it's a huge, a bit of illusion. Yes, I mean, like I say, when you go to the Olympia, you have these guys, but those guys they're like barely human beings, right? But again, if you compared even them to the mountain, you'd probably be surprised. And he's actually an interesting phenomenon, a bit of a tangent, in that unlike some of the other guys in strongman contests, when he stands, he actually has a fairly narrow waist relative to his upper body. He actually has a pleasing physique. Compared to a lot of strongmen. I could see him actually competing in a bodybuilding contest.
If he could lean down, I could see it.
And doing okay. Whereas, some of the other big power lifters, like if you look at Bill Kazmaier and stuff like that, probably mispronounce his name. Obviously big, powerful men, but they didn't have a physique in sort of the classic way.
Well, looking at watching the Olympics, like Lasher yesterday, just smashing the world record, and but if you looked at him on the street, saw him sat in a restaurant, your instant thought wouldn't be athlete.
That's right, yeah, and for them. So changing gears a little bit, Ellington Darden recently, and this is kind of like the Pope deciding that priests can get married. I said that he was wrong about getting people to go to failure. Have you read some of his latest things? And
I haven't.
He feels that people should stop short of failure, ending their sets with a 20 or 30 second slow negative, but even that one should be short of failure and really focusing on form over intensity. He says both are important, intensity and form, but form's more important than intensity. Now, I don't think it's as revolutionary as it sounds if you really stop and think about it. But any thoughts on that? A lot of people sort of raised eyebrows going like Ellington Darden, he's, one who wrote books about people spending 30 minutes on the floor after a workout and this incredible intensity that Arthur Jones would put people through. And now he's turning around saying, don't go to failure.
So I think largely, so if we take into account the body of literature that we have that has looked at whether you should train to failure or not to failure, there are a number of limitations with the study designs that have been used and the way that question has been formulated. Like it's been presented as a quite dichotomous thing. It's like failure or not failure, when really it's a continuum. It's, well, failure's at one end, and I suppose you could add in advanced techniques, but we've done a number of studies that suggest you don't need to go past that. I certainly feel that you probably don't need to go to failure to optimize adaptation. The issue is we don't necessarily know what the shape of the dose-response relationship between proximity to failure and outcomes actually look like. Now, the old school kind of hit thing, Arthur or Mike's analogy with the hammer and things like that are just biologically implausible given everything we kind of know about muscular adaptation. It's very unlikely that there is a threshold phenomenon, like what we would call in sort of like a modeling term, like a step function. It's not like you do a rep, you do a rep, you do a rep, there's nothing, and then boom, you hit a certain rep and all the adaptation switches on. What's more than likely to happen is some kind of, either sort of exponential growth function, or even like a kind of, the majority of adaptations are actually coming early on, and then it starts to plateau out more and more the closer you get to failure. Now, one of the issues we have, but this does tell us we don't need to go to failure, is that the vast majority of studies have compared what you could probably say are failure versus quite close to failure. So they're both looking at both quite high effort conditions. I would probably also quibble as to whether or not most of these studies that have been conducted have actually operationally defined failure in a way that, I would kind of deign to be kind of like rigorous enough. So it's probably, if I was really being sort of like a cynic, I would say it's like two conditions not to failure, but both fairly close to failure. That is what most of the literature has probably done. But so I guess to sort of like, I think, Ellington's great, but I think this is probably, as much as I hate to say it, it's probably to someone, it's going to be another book. Like, I assume it is already another book.
Yeah.
But it's nothing revolutionary. No, there's no evidence that there's no good evidence that it's going to produce any greater adaptation than just going to failure. I have always, and I'm happy to admit my bias here, like lent towards the practical value of just training to failure, or having that as the goal you aim for in training, because appreciably, a lot of people struggle to get there without supervision, without other approaches to try and mitigate associated discomfort that prevents them from sort of pushing close enough to failure and things like that. But also the fact that when people try to stop short of failure, people are not very good at judging how close to failure they actually are. And we've done studies examining this, and just last year we published a study that used quite a unique design where we kind of deceived participants. They had no idea what we were actually looking at how good they were at predicting how close to failure they were. So there was no kind of what we call demand characteristics, where sometimes you set up a study, if people know what you're looking for, you tend to find what you're looking for, particularly if it's something that they've got control over. So we set up a study to do that. And then we've also recently done a meta-analysis of all studies that have looked at predictive ability. And in general, people underestimate. So I always kind of put those two things together in terms of what would I then practically recommend for people, which is to say, well, you should probably aim for failure, but not sweat it if you don't quite get there because you struggle to push it. But if you aim to not go to failure, then there is a chance that you might be leaving, and it might actually not be enough to matter. But one thing we also know is training to failure doesn't get you worse outcomes than not training to failure. So it's almost like, well, it's a catch-all, it's a safety net. Like, aim for that, shoot for the stars, and you might reach the moon. If we're coming up with pithy quotes.
Arthur Jones was obviously a brilliant man, but he, much of what he came up with was not based on scientific research. It was based on deduction and induction of various things, which he many times, got pretty darn close to a lot of things. But he also would use analogies, and a lot of people would quote his analogies. And one of the things I've often thought is an analogy is nice, but it's not science.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, one analogy you no doubt heard of is the idea of forming a callus, and how you have to do it. But one of the things that comes to mind about not going to failure is I play guitar, and I have calluses on my fingertips. Well, I never train to failure. I never, play guitar till my fingers bleed, right? And I play guitar fairly frequently. It's not like I need to, and I've got calluses. So, that sort of thing. But just a little, and I just want to touch on one thing. I want to talk about cardio, and a paper you had presented some time ago about there's no such thing as cardio. But just quickly, some people claim that going to failure creates central nervous system burnout. Is that a pseudo-scientific term that somebody's come up with in the gym, or is there any evidence? What did he even mean by that? And is it just sort of bro science? Is there anything behind that?
I mean, it is largely, from my perspective, bro science, given what we know. So, I mean, there's an interest. There are various ways of looking at what is termed to be central fatigue. To lean on some research that we did last year. One, so this is interesting actually, because it's something I've actually changed my views on. There's something called non-local muscle fatigue, and so this is, for example, we will use a protocol where we might train like the upper body. And what we'll do is we'll see whether training the upper body has any impact on fatigue in the lower body. Or you might train one limb and see if it has an effect on the other limb. And the idea being that the fatigue experienced by the limb engaged in any kind of exercise protocol is a combination of both central and peripheral contributions to any reduction in performance and fatigue. Whereas the other limb, which didn't do the stimulus, should in theory have no peripheral fatiguing mechanisms involved in it. So any drop in performance is indicative of some central mechanisms for fatigue. So whether it's central nervous system, or it might be some kind of circulating metabolites that might be interfering with performance and function. So we last year, this was led by a colleague of ours, Dave Beam, who's based at Newfoundland in Canada. He led a systematic review and meta-analysis of studies that had looked at non-local muscle fatigue. Now, earlier in the year, we collaborated on a study that we collected data in our lab, and we actually looked to see the effect that a heavy load versus a light load protocol performed to failure had on non-local and local muscle fatigue, because we were interested in kind of this idea of like, does doing heavy loads or light loads affect your central nervous system fatigue? And we didn't just look at like immediate fatigue. We looked at fatigue over, I think it was 48 hours post protocol. And we saw some interesting results. We saw that, if I'm remembering rightly, the heavy load condition to failure, so I think it was 80% of their MVC versus maybe 50%. So like 80% of 1 rep max versus 50% of 1 rep max. The 80% condition, although there was central fatigue immediately afterwards, there was a non-local muscle fatigue effect. By 24 hours, it was back up to baseline. Whereas the lower load, the central fatigue lasted longer. It took up to, I think it was 48 hours to recover. But nonetheless, we saw evidence of non-local muscle fatigue, which we interpreted as being indicative of, central nervous system mechanisms potentially. So this was interesting. So we had done a study in our lab that had shown this. We then did this big meta-analysis, and we ended up including just shy of 60 studies, I think. We had, it was a huge meta-analysis. We had just shy of 300 measures included in this from several hundred participants. And what we did was we essentially looked to see, like, is there evidence of a non-local muscle fatigue phenomena across all these studies? And when you pull all of the studies together and appropriately analyze it, you actually see that there's not actually even any evidence that non-local muscle fatigue is a phenomena that exists. And what you see is there's just as many studies showing an effect that shows there is fatigue as there are studies showing that actually performance improves. And so the average effect is actually zero. And what we're seeing is probably just this sampling variation of people's, repeated measures of performance. And so I've kind of come to this position where I'm not necessarily convinced that, at least with the kinds of resistance training protocols and things like that we look at, and the types of protocols that people are generally talking about, that there's really any meaningful impact on central fatigue mechanisms anyway. One thing we did see in a kind of subgroup analysis, we split all of the outcomes into, was fatigue measured as a decrease in strength or a decrease in power or a decrease in endurance performance. And we did see that there might be some effect on endurance outcomes, but not strength, not power. None of those outcomes seem to be affected. But when you dig into the studies that have looked at endurance, what you actually see is that this might be mediated more by psychological mechanisms and physiological. So people, if you do a fatiguing protocol and people feel tired afterwards, even if their even if you measure their performance objectively, like say you measure their strength and their strength hasn't gone down, so then you give them 50% of their 1 rep max to do repetitions with. After a non-local fatiguing protocol, they'll probably perform worse, but it's not because they're actually fatigued. They feel fatigued, and therefore it feels more effortful to do it. So it feels like they get to the point where they feel like they're at max effort, and so they stop performing, because to them it feels like they're trying as hard as they can. So it seems as though it might be mediated more. It might be more endurance outcomes and mediated potentially more by endurance effect. And there's some really cool studies that have come out of University of Bristol. A guy called Aaron Greenhouse. Is a double-barreled name, and I'm going to forget the pronunciation now. Anyway, they've done some really cool studies which have kind of demonstrated this link between making people feel fatigued but not peripherally fatiguing, and then testing the performance in that muscle and showing that it's linked to how fatigued they feel and how much effort it feels like there is. And so yeah, long answer is no. Central fatigue from training to failure or anything like that is a kind of pseudoscience, really.
Okay, so you did a video some time back entitled, I'm paraphrasing here, correct me, "There's no such thing as cardio." And I watched it a couple times, and I've also read a lot of the comments on the YouTube video where it's been posted. It may have been posted by different people. 21 Convention posted it, you may have posted it. And of course, from the comments, obviously you didn't make the sale with everyone. And so I guess my question is, and I'm going to sort of qualify it a little bit, is I think we probably both agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that if your goal is to enter a 10K, that you should spend some time practicing running a 10K in order to improve your performance. But just from the point of view of improving cardiovascular function, have you changed your mind at all about the basic premise that you can get all the conditioning you need without any steady state activities? I know I'm making a blanket statement there, so correct me and let me know what you think.
So I think by and large, and we've actually, again, more recently than that, we were invited to write a paper. This was contextualized with respect to conditioning, exercise countermeasures for conditioning, microgravity induced physical deconditioning. So we wrote about this topic in the context of counteracting deconditioning relative to like spaceflight and things like that. But as part of this, we did a more up-to-date review of this area, and so building on the earlier work that was presented in that review, we actually, again, like when you look over the literature, I guess one thing to contextualize is well, first of all, the title from that was deliberately provocative. So, when I say no such thing as cardio, what I mean is it's a little bit like I don't like the term strength training, and I tend to use resistance training, because actually there's a lot of things that you can do that improve strength. And also, doing strength training doesn't just improve strength, it improves a range of different things. So, it would be like saying, well, we know the range of motion and flexibility can improve as a result of resistance training. So I'm going to call it flexibility training. Everyone think, well, that's ridiculous. So it was more to say, like, look, if you think that if you're calling this cardio training because you think this exclusively is improving cardiorespiratory fitness, then that's a misnomer, because actually there are other modalities that can improve those outcomes as well. So I think, I'm generally of the opinion still that when, depending upon how you operationalize and then measure these concepts, if you do so in such a way that is a more valid operationalization of them, because like the example there, like a 10K performance in a 10K is a quite complicated outcome measure. I mean, in theory, it's quite simple. It's how quickly can you run 10K, but that is contributed by not just your cardiorespiratory fitness, is contributed by a whole host of different things. And so you can use it as a measure of how cardiorespiratory, how fit you are from a cardiorespiratory perspective, but it's also going to be influenced by a range of other things. So it's not necessarily a really good, valid operationalization of that concept, and there are other ways to look at it. One issue we obviously know that we have as well is when you with exercise-based interventions, how you measure outcomes, particularly when they relate to performance, will be biased towards an intervention that replicates those. So one of the things we did in this more up-to-date review was say, well, let's talk through the physiological mechanisms as we talked through them before, and we kind of make a case for, again, this is how science in theory kind of should work. We make observations, we use induction to kind of develop possible models that we think are explanatory of the phenomena that we're looking at. But then those models will make predictions. They will make, and we take those predictions and then we develop hypotheses like operationalizations that we can, experiments and ways of measuring these things that we can use to test the predictions of that model. And so we kind of take it through by saying, what's the underlying kind of inductive phenomena that we're looking at? What's the kind of model and predictions? Well, we're saying that these physiological, the stimulus that's provided from these are similar. And so in theory, then the output should be similar, the adaptation should be similar. So that's the prediction. And then we can look at different studies and see whether they're good tests of that hypothesis. Well, one of the arguments we make is that if you match the volume and effort, then the external modality of resistance is what, like, your muscle doesn't care about. Like, it doesn't know what it is. You know what it is, but only through your interpretation of the information that you're receiving regarding it. But your muscle isn't consciously aware of it, and so all of the physiological apparatus that supports it, producing force to resist that, that external resistance modality shouldn't, in theory, be supported in the same way. But, and this is the caveat, only if the volume and the effort levels are similar between the modalities. So we then kind of look at, well, there are actually a lot of studies that have looked at resistance training versus cardio, but what they are is traditional resistance training versus traditional steady state cardio. And when you look at those studies, some show no difference in strength outcomes or cardiorespiratory fitness outcomes between them, and some studies do show differences. Some studies show that resistance training improves strength better. Some studies show that cardiorespiratory training improves cardiorespiratory fitness better. But when you then delve into, like, well, how they measured those things, you normally see that, like, the strength training outcomes are measured as a 1 rep max in the exercises that they performed, or they trained on a treadmill and then they tested VO2 max on a treadmill, and so they got better at performing the tests, essentially. So what we did was we kind of looked over those studies and said, look, we can look at all of these things, and this is the results they show, but they're not good tests of what we're talking about. What we really need is studies that have matched the volume, matched the effort, and ideally used outcome measures that are not biased towards a given intervention. So we need good operationalizations of those. And then, I mean, there's the issue we have is there's still very few studies that have done a good job of doing that. We've done a few studies. We've done, annoyingly, one got cut short because of COVID, but we've presented the initial data from it in this review. I think I think I'm remembering off the top of my head, and there's maybe 4 or 5 studies that have looked at strength outcomes. And there's only one study that's looked at hypertrophy outcomes, and that's the one that got cut short, unfortunately, in our lab. So we've not got great data on that. And then maybe 4 studies or 3 studies that have looked at cardiorespiratory fitness outcomes. And what we did is we actually took all these studies and then we did a small meta-analysis of them. And generally, when you take those studies, there's very little difference in terms of both strength and cardiorespiratory fitness outcomes when, quote unquote, cardio modalities or resistance training modalities are performed with a similar volume and a similar degree of effort, and the outcome measures are not biased towards one or the other. So, for example, it might be cardio on a cycle ergometer versus, say, a leg press. But then what we do is we'll test isolated isometric knee extension strength as the outcome measure, or we'll measure cardiorespiratory performance, say, on the treadmill. So we've got a less biased comparison between the two. But yeah, I think in general that like the evidence we have, I still think we need to do better, more rigorous tests of it. And that's, I'm hoping what we'll be able to do is once we can get back into the lab more regularly and we can get that study back up and running and start recruiting for it again, we'll be able to get it up to a sufficient sample size to be a better test of that. And we're also in that study using within participant design. So instead of, say, taking a group of people to do this and a group of people do that, we've actually got people training one leg on the leg press and one leg on the recumbent cycle ergometer. And so we're comparing within individuals. So, you know, things like genetics and other elements are controlled. It's also nice because it means that because all of those things are controlled, to get a good precise estimate of the comparison between the two, we don't need quite so many individuals to take part in the study, although we still need probably twice as many as we've got at the moment.
What do you think, and we may run out of time here, have you read Ken Hutchins' book, Heartstrong?
No, I don't think I have. I think I might have been sent a copy of it though. Was it, is that a recent one? Oh no, I think I got sent, he did one about dancers or something recently.
Music and dance. So yeah, Heartstrong came out about the same, and I'm going to try and hopefully do it justice, but his argument, which is based a little bit on Doug McGuff's, is that strength training, because of the greater venous return, creates greater stroke volume with every heartbeat, as opposed to just accelerating the heart rate, which is usually, you know, the goal in traditional cardio, that you have a greater stroke volume. And as a result of that, the greater stroke volume causes a greater perfusion of, you know, new capillaries and arteries and creates better circulation, and that you're improving the cardiovascular from that point of view better with proper strength training, you know, like a super slow continuous tension type of thing, than you are with a steady state where you have a series of split-second contractions. Say, for example, in a jogger, every time you're, and that's not exactly right because you're not moving, but usually the contractions are every time the heel strikes, there's a bit of a contraction until the next heel strikes type of thing. And just sort of on that, that's the argument also that Doug McGuff's made about greater venous return and therefore providing better cardiovascular benefits. In Bill Desimont's book, interestingly, he talks about why strength training is a poorer cardiovascular for exactly the opposite reason, because it creates greater pooling of the blood and less venous return. So I found that interesting. Is one person, two people, both of whom I respect, says strength training creates greater venous return. Bill seems to say, and Bill, if you're listening to this, you can correct me if I made a mistake here, that working out with weights creates pooling of the blood in the extremities and less venous return. So obviously it can be both. Somebody's wrong here.
I mean, this is where, like, and you know, I love Bill. I consider him a good friend. I've not met Ken, but this is where I've very much kind of I've fallen out of love of the sorts of kind of inductive speculation that well, actually no, let me correct that. Like, so a lot these two arguments are and I must admit, like, I don't know, I've not read either of the books, but from your description, my assumption is, and this is partly because I can anticipate that the studies that I would think that need to be done to test what those hypotheses actually are have probably not been done, based on my awareness of the literature, you know, the scientific literature on this. But this is where, like, things like that remain to be that remain as hypotheses to be tested, and that's quite. Those are two claims that can quite well not easily be tested, because actually it's quite difficult to do those kinds of studies. But these are things where at this point in time, they're speculative still. They're based on kind of perhaps they're you know, okay, I misspoke and said that they were inductive, but they're based on I guess interpretations of what we think you know, how the circulatory system works given you know, a particular engagement in a particular form of exercise. And so they're deductions from what we think would happen in those situations. Well, we can test those, we can measure that, we can do the studies to do that. But I think until we've done those studies, they remain as deductive predictions from a given interpretation of what the kind of what they think the model of how that works out actually is. I think this is where I have a big kind of like, I've become like a really grumpy cynic over time, like, and I sort of try to keep a smile on my face about it and not get too stressed out about it. Like, life's too short. But I think over time, I've realized that a lot of what kind of sounds like scientific arguments are not scientific arguments. They are kind of, it sounds really bad, but they're kind of a form of kind of scientism. Like once you start talking about things that sound like physiological or biomechanical or this that, and the other, and they're based on this textbook and that textbook, like they're not necessarily scientific in the way that well, arguably different philosophy of science is still going on, and we're not not everyone would agree with a falsificationist kind of Popperian stance on what demarcates science and not science. But these are, you can't come up with a plausible sounding thing and expect everyone to buy that idea because it's plausible sounding. You need to empirically test the predictions of your plausible sounding model and its hypotheses.
So let me just finish. My client's going to walk in shortly. I'm just going to see if I can paraphrase. I know, in fairness to Doug McGuff, when he first came up with the idea of greater Venus return, I believe he said, "Things I believe but can't prove." Right? So he admitted, and then Ken, I believe, sort of really hung his hat on it and sort of took it and disclosed it as fact. But could it be a little bit of what's going on is filling in the blanks with appeal to authority? In other words, it's in this textbook, so I'm going to put it in my book and go from there because it was in a textbook that says that. So is there a bit of filling in of the blanks maybe would appeal to authority? I know I'm not giving you much time to.
No, I think there can be that. And that's not to say, like, we all have to kind of to some extent work with heuristics here. And I'll give you kind of like why I've kind of shifted my thoughts on it. Like the early review that we wrote and the talk that I gave around the cardio, example, that was more heavily lent towards like reviewing physiological mechanisms and developing kind of, model and hypothesis and things like that. I don't think I did a very good job of presenting it. That's what it was. I think we presented it early on. No, I wrote this paper 10 years ago now. It was more, I presented it as here's the evidence of why this is correct. And over time realized that actually, no, this is a model that makes predictions and we don't have good studies that have tested the predictions of that model. So that's what I need to do. And so that's what we've been sort of working towards over time. And, so for example, I off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember, because again, it was like 10 years ago, but there was a paper that does demonstrate that resistance training produces, greater venous return, or at least there is an enhanced kind of cardiac output as a result of resistance training, with a leg press protocol. And I'm going to forget, it's been a long time. It's been a decade since I read those studies, but it's been a long time since I've looked at those studies, partly because we've moved on to the testing of the predictions of that model, and nothing fundamentally has changed over that time to make us think that we need to question the auxiliary assumptions associated with that model for how things work. And it might even be that actually, well, we've seen from the evidence we have thus far that measures of cardiorespiratory fitness, measures of strength, when they're unbiased, do not seem to differ between effort and volume matched differing modalities of exercise. But it might well be that actually some of the underlying physiological mechanisms are not the right explanation of why that is as well. Right. So we might have got the black box bit wrong as well. Who knows? So I guess you could take quite a strong empiricist stance and say, like, it's nice to have the explanation, but actually it might also be that who cares why? Like, we can geek out on it, but
I really appreciate you taking the time. I wish I had another, I'm sure, over beverages, we could talk for a couple of hours and whatnot. So I really appreciate it. I apologize for maybe a little bit of an abrupt ending. I have a client coming in, But
No
it's
worries.
a very good pleasure. And if you can send me a little bit about your bio and whatnot that I can include, and looking forward to maybe at some point in the future, if you're open to it, maybe doing it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I would love that. It's been great fun to chat.
Your time and help is greatly appreciated.